Ave Maria.
We've been considering sin, which is the bane of our lives here on earth. It's the warfare that we're constantly fighting. It's the enemy that we have to face, and it of itself it has consequences. It has consequences both for good or for bad. In as much good, it has consequences for the good, as much as if we overcome it, then we have become stronger as a result. And in addition to that, we are conformed to Christ. But if we are overcome by it, then we are, in fact, enemies of God, as St. Paul tells us. But God, who's always merciful, is always eagerly waiting for us to return home, as the father waited for the prodigal son. In fact, in the very beginning of the scriptures, in chapter 4, where Cain and Abel have a confrontation, the Lord warns Cain and says to him, "Sin is at your door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it." And so, right at the very beginning, we see that it's possible to master sin. Difficult, but nonetheless possible. What we've been doing so far is looking at the various ways in which we participate in sin, either, of course, by ourselves committing it or by others committing it, and then we somehow get involved in it. Or we haven't committed it, how we involve other people in it. And we've considered counsel, where we give advice. There's also command, where we have authority and we exercise the authority to entice others to sin. By consent, simply by not disagreeing. By provocation, where we deliberately go out um, to lead someone into sin. And then there's praise or flattery, where this is a kind of seduction. And then there's concealment, where we hide the sin, and or by being a partner in the sin. And then last to a silence, right, by not objecting. And then the worst perhaps is to defend that which is wrong, to defend sin. And this last one is what we face currently in our world, where sinful behaviors are defended. So if we consider concealment for a moment, what do we know? To conceal means to hide. And perhaps a very good example is that of Jacob and his sons. In the 37th chapter of Genesis, we read the story, in fact, of Joseph. How did he find himself in trouble? Why did his brothers hate him? Was it simply because the love his father showed for him, or was there something more? Well, not unsurprisingly, there was something more. What it was exactly, we're not told. But in the second verse of the 37th chapter, we read this: Jacob, beginning in verse 1, Jacob settled in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is his family history. When Joseph was 17 years old, he was tending the flocks with his brothers. He was an assistant to the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah, and he brought his father bad reports about them. That's what we're told. And these two, the sons that it refers to, the sons of Jacob's concubines. And there's going to be another little problem with that arrangement. So Joseph was helping them out. He's the assistant, and he brought a bad report. And of course, that's going to provoke, as you can imagine, a lot of mistrust and anger between the brothers. He was a snitch, in other words. However, um, as I said, we're not told what the offense was, but it seems to be serious enough for Jacob to be annoyed. Joseph himself acted with the best intentions. He was a virtuous young man, as we can see from his subsequent history. He was virtuous and he acted with the right intention. And he was alerting his father to his brother's sins. He acted out of true love of God because we God is offended by sin, and we should ensure, as far as possible, that um, sin is something to be avoided. And secondly, out of love for his brothers, because their sin was in fact endangering their lives, their spiritual lives. Jacob should have corrected his sons, and certainly he should have ensured that the brothers understood that Joseph acted correctly and that he acted virtuously and he acted out of love. If he had kept quiet, he would in fact have shared in his brother's sins simply by silence. And what is more, he would be responsible for any further sins that they committed. So there is, uh, it is virtuous, in fact, to reveal wrongdoing, and we must make the distinction. It shouldn't be done out of malice. It shouldn't be done out of revenge. It should be done for the good of the person, and it should also be done to lawful authority. That is, someone who can correct the problem. And in all of this, Joseph acted correctly. Even in law, in civil law, we have that same principle. In civil law, the same principle applies because if you conceal a crime, you are regarded as a participant in the crime, are we not? We have another example in the case of Reuben, and this also is in Genesis 37. Um, we we see when we know the story, um, Jacob sends Joseph to bring food for his brothers, and he goes off. He knows the animosity that his brothers have towards him. He doesn't find them where he expected to, and so what does he do? He asks, um, he asks the people around, you know, where his brothers are, and he's told they at Dothan. So he undertakes this additional journey to find his brothers. He could easily have gone back and said, "I can't find them," but as I said, he was a virtuous man, and he didn't harbor any ill will towards his brothers. And so when the brothers spot him, they immediately say, "Hey, comes the dreamer. Let us kill him." And so the brothers, what do they do? We were told in verse 21, when Reuben heard this, he tried to save him, Joseph, from their hands, saying, "We must not take his life. Instead of shedding blood," he continued, "just throw him into the cistern there in the desert. But don't kill him outright." We're then told his purpose was to rescue him from their hands and restore him to his father. So when Joseph came up to them, they stripped him of his long tunic he had on, and they took him and threw him into the cistern, which was empty and dry. Then they sat down and ate their meal. So the brothers, as a whole, probably led by the four he had reported, they um, decide they're going to kill him, but Reuben intervenes with the good intention that he would rescue him. The question is, well, why did he want to do that? And the answer was, Reuben, by the way, was the firstborn, and he had lost the rights of the firstborn, because of a very serious sin. He seduced one of his father's concubines, and so he was out of favor. And so he was hoping that by restoring Joseph, his father would relent a little, and he would regain the rights of the firstborn. So there's a little bit of self-interest there, but nonetheless, at least he's doing the right thing. However, he does not complete what he began, because we're told that the the when the traders come, it is Judah who suggests selling him. And Judah is saying, look, we can get some money out of this. What's the point in killing him? At least if we sell him, we'll get rid of him and we'll have some change in the bargain. And so when we look at the whole scenario, we find that the brothers committed many sins. First of all, envy, which led to hatred. There was abuse because they seized Joseph. They stripped him of his tunic. No doubt they gave him a few blows. They desired blood, and then they threw him into the cistern and sat down and ate the food he brought for them. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine all the time Joseph is very afraid, and he was probably begging them for pity, but none of it. So um, when Reuben returns, he'd gone away perhaps to look after the flock. When he returns, the boy is gone, and he's alarmed. He says the boy is gone, and he's told what has happened. And so when we look at it at the whole scenario, we see that Reuben and Judah, in fact, sinned the least, because they both at least saved Joseph's life. But they did not tell Jacob, their father, what had happened. They didn't tell him the truth. And Jacob is heartbroken because he's lost his favorite son. And he weeps and says that I'll never see him again. I shall go down to Sheol, and that's where I'll see him, and so on. So for many years, because remember that Joseph was in Egypt for a long time, it's 20 years or so. All of this time, Jacob is pining, and the brothers did nothing to alleviate his pain. Instead, they concealed the sin. They concocted the story about finding his clothes covered in blood and so on. And then we find Jacob himself had acted foolishly in as much as he displayed the love he had for Joseph openly, and so he provided the cause for the brothers' envy. And also, he was paying for his own sins, because you recall that Jacob was deceitful. He had stolen his own brother's birthright, or at least he deceptively received it, the father's blessing. And so just as he deceived, so he now is being deceived. And again, scripture tells us that God often punishes us with the very sins that we commit. And so we have two examples here. One, Joseph, who lawfully reveals the sin, and we have the contrary, where the sin is hidden. And we see that in the first, Joseph was not involved in his brother's sins, and second, the brothers, in fact, they shared. In fact, they were partners, collaborators in each other's sin. We have another example. That's in the book of Esther. And Esther is a very interesting book to read. Well, as all the books of scripture. But it gives us many examples of how, in fact, we ought to live our life. The story begins with Mordecai, who is a Jew. We're told that, and this is really a prologue to the story, that Mordecai took his rest in the courtyard with Bigthan and Teresh. the two eunuchs of the king who kept watch in the courtyard. So he's resting, and he overheard their conversation and inquired into their purpose, what you're talking about, and learned that they were preparing a revolution. They're going to lay hands on the king. And so what does he do? He informs the king. The king examined the two eunuchs, and after they had confessed their plan, they were led away to execution. And the king made a permanent record of these things. Mordecai wrote an account of them. And the king ordered Mordecai to serve in the court and rewarded him for these things. So here we have Mordecai, who overhears a conversation. It's essentially a revolution, rebellion against lawful authority. He warns the king of it. And the culprits are punished, and he himself is rewarded. Why did he do this? He's a Jew, and the king is not. He was first and foremost a servant of God. He was obedient to God, and he knew that all authority comes from God, and that it was a sin to rebel against lawfully established authority, even if that authority is corrupt. It is wrong for the individual to take action on his own. There always has to be a process, and this is for the good of the society. So Mordecai, as being a servant of God and of the king, was obliged to reveal the conspiracy. To conceal the eunuch's sin would in fact be to share in it. And of course, if he had kept quiet and the conspiracy was carried out and failed, he also would have been involved. He would be regarded as guilty because he is seen that he had a duty to expose the sin, to expose the danger to the king. And so the concealment or the hiding of the sin of others is itself a sin. However, the sin must be revealed for the right reasons and to the right person. That is, it must be revealed without malice or vindictiveness. It must be done to warn others of the danger, and it must be told to those who have a right to know. For example, knowing that a certain person is dishonest, one has obligation to put a potential employer on his guard. In the case of a couple getting married, anyone knowing why the marriage should not take place is bound to reveal it. In fact, the bans are pronounced for that very reason. Does anybody know why this couple should not be married and may not be joined in lawful matrimony? And you have an obligation to say if there is a valid reason they should not be joined. And also, of course, the same applies for ordination. The same applies for ordination. If someone is to be ordained, then the announcement is made. Does anybody know of any reason, any valid reason, why the person should not be promoted to orders, whether to the diaconate or the priesthood or even the episcopacy? Failure to do that means that if the person is unworthy and you knew the person was unworthy and said nothing, you're going to be responsible for the sins that the person commits. So it's a very serious matter, So if, for instance, you know that a person is dishonest and the person is going to be ordained to the priesthood or the diaconate, and you keep quiet, you don't tell the bishop, then if the person steals from the church, you're responsible. You also carry that sin. This is a very serious obligation and responsibility. If, however, you do inform the bishop and the bishop decides to go ahead and ordain the person, then the bishop can't say he didn't know. So he now is responsible for the sins of the cleric. So we were talking about a very serious matter here, and we can think of it on a personal note. If you're getting involved in some business arrangement with someone, and you believe the person to be honest, you'd be very grateful if someone brings evidence to show it. Look, this is not a good person to go into business with, you know. So concealment of sins, serious sins, is itself sinful and it's also a serious matter.
Santa Maria, Mater